It was just before 8 in the morning on a Wednesday in April, and Clint Bobo woke up to the sound of the family dogs barking outside the house near Darden, Tennessee. He looked out and saw his sister Holly kneeling in the garage, facing a man dressed head to toe in camouflage, the two of them talking back and forth, Holly's voice sounding upset. He assumed the man was her boyfriend, Drew, and went back to what he was doing. Moments later, his mother called from work, having just heard that a neighbor reported a scream from the house. Karen told Clint plainly, "That isn't Drew. Grab a gun and go outside." By the time Clint reached the garage, there was blood on the floor, and his sister was gone. Before we go further into this story, please consider subscribing to Cold Case Whisperer. It's much appreciated, and it helps us keep bringing you real cold case stories like this one. Holly Lynn Bobo was 20 years old in April of 2011, a nursing student at the University of Tennessee at Martin's Parsons Center, living with her family in the small, rural community of Darden in West Tennessee, a place defined by farmland, wooded hills, and the kind of tight-knit population where nearly everyone had grown up knowing everyone else. She was, by every account, left behind by the people who knew her, focused on building a career in healthcare and deeply connected to her family, particularly her parents, Karen and Dana Bobo, and her older brother, Clint, with whom she shared the family home on that April morning, a home that, before that day, had never known this kind of tragedy. Friends and classmates who spoke publicly in the years after her disappearance described a young woman who was shy, sweet, caring, and looking forward to a future in nursing, the kind of ordinary, hopeful trajectory that made the abruptness of what happened to her all the more difficult for the surrounding community to absorb. Nothing about her life, as her family and investigators would later piece together, suggested she was in any kind of danger, and nothing about the morning of April 13th, 2011, began as anything other than ordinary. Holly had woken at 4:30 that morning to study for an exam, and by 7:30 her parents had already left for work. Her mother, Karen, off to teach second grade at a nearby elementary school. At around 7:30, Holly's boyfriend, Drew Scott, called her cell phone, letting her know he was out turkey hunting on her grandmother's property nearby. She made her last outgoing call 12 minutes later at 7:42. Sometime in the minutes after that call, a neighbor heard a scream coming from the direction of the Bobo home. That is precisely what made what Clint saw next, and what he did not immediately understand the significance of, so difficult to process in the hours and days that followed, because when the dogs woke him and he looked outside to find his sister kneeling in the garage with a man in camouflage, his first instinct was that nothing was wrong at all. It was only after his mother's phone call, and after he found blood on the garage floor, that Clint understood he was not looking at an ordinary morning. By the time he called 911, Holly and the man in camouflage were already gone, last seen by Clint heading up a trail toward the woods behind the property. Police arrived at the Bobo home within 10 minutes of that call, and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation later confirmed that the blood found in the garage matched Holly's DNA. Physical proof that whatever had happened to her had begun right there, just steps from her own front door. What followed was one of the largest search operations in the history of Tennessee law enforcement, a mobilization that stretched on for weeks and, in various forms, for years afterward, as investigators periodically returned to re-examine terrain that had already been searched once, twice, sometimes several times over. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, working alongside the FBI and hundreds of volunteers from the surrounding communities, combed the wooded terrain around the Bobo property for weeks, searching areas that would become familiar names throughout the years-long investigation, Bible Hill, Yellow Springs, Gooch Road, and the banks of Horny Head Creek, difficult, densely wooded terrain that made even a coordinated, well-resourced search agonizingly slow. Community prayer vigils were held within the first week of Holly's disappearance, drawing large crowds of neighbors, classmates, and strangers moved by the story of a young nursing student who had simply vanished a few dozen steps from her own front door. Yellow ribbons and missing person posters bearing Holly's photograph appeared throughout the surrounding counties, in gas stations, churches, and storefronts, a visual presence that would remain part of the region's landscape for years, long after most missing persons cases fade from public memory, a constant, quiet reminder to everyone who passed them that a young woman from their own community was still out there somewhere, unaccounted for. Despite the scale of the search, no immediate trace of Holly turned up, and the investigation, in its earliest months, struggled to move beyond the single description Clint had provided, that of an unidentified man in camouflage whose face he had not clearly seen. Investigators pursued numerous leads in the years that followed, some more promising than others, a process that stretched the initial investigation across seasons and then across years without ever producing the kind of definitive break the Bobo family and the broader community were desperate for. One name that surfaced early was Terry Britt, registered sex offender who lived near the Bobo family and who had a documented history of stalking women, specifically, according to investigators, women with blonde hair and blue eyes, a description that matched Holly. Britt's alibi for the morning of April 13th was described by the lead case agent at the time as weak, and Holly's cousin reported that Britt had been seen staring at them in the days before her disappearance. Even Holly's mother, Karen Bobo, reportedly told investigators that Britt was someone they needed to look into closely. The lead investigator on the case at the time later stated publicly that he did not believe Holly's abduction had been a crime of passion carried out in a single impulsive moment, and that his working theory pointed toward planning rather than opportunity, a theory that, in his view, argued against the involvement of a group and toward a single predator acting alone, consistent with the pattern he believed he saw in Britt's documented history. Despite this attention, and despite years of scrutiny, Britt was investigated but never charged with any crime connected to Holly Bobo's disappearance, and under the law he must be regarded as never having been proven responsible for anything related to her case. In 2013, another development briefly reignited hope and then extinguished it just as quickly when a pink purse was discovered along Miracle Town Road. Word spread quickly through the community and through the family that the purse might finally be the piece of physical evidence everyone had been waiting nearly 2 years for. Karen Bobo was asked to examine it, and after inspecting the purse closely, she confirmed that it was not her daughter's, a small, painful reminder of how many false leads a case like this one generates over the course of years, each one carrying the family through a fresh cycle of hope and disappointment, a cycle investigators later acknowledged was almost as difficult for the family to endure as the silence itself. The case did not fade from public attention the way many missing persons cases eventually do. Throughout 2011, 2012, and 2013, local Tennessee news outlets continued to run periodic updates on the investigation status. Community fundraisers helped support the search efforts, and the reward fund offered for information leading to Holly's recovery, and her family, particularly her mother, Karen, became a familiar and determined public presence, giving interviews and making appeals for any new information as the years passed without resolution. For a rural community the size of Darden and the surrounding counties, A disappearance of the scale, and the uncertainty that stretched on for nearly 3 years without an arrest, left a mark that extended well beyond the Bobo family itself, shaping how residents thought about safety, about strangers on rural roads, and about a young woman who had simply walked toward the tree line one ordinary morning and never returned. The break that would finally move the case forward came in February and March of 2014, nearly 3 years after Holly vanished, a stretch of time during which the investigation had, by most public accounts, grown increasingly difficult, with fewer new leads surfacing and the trail of the man in camouflage growing colder with each passing season. On February 28, 2014, investigators executed a search warrant at the home of a man named Zachary Adams. Days later, on March 3, 2014, Adams's brother, John Dylan Adams, was arrested on unrelated charges. During questioning connected to that arrest, Dylan Adams told investigators that he had witnessed his brother Zachary rape and kill Holly Bobo. Zachary Adams was arrested shortly afterward and charged with aggravated kidnapping and first-degree murder, charges that would eventually expand as the investigation continued to develop over the following months. News that reached the Bobo family and the wider community almost 3 full years to the week after Holly had first disappeared into the trees behind her family's home. If a case built on this kind of patient, years-long investigative work is the kind of story that keeps you coming back to this channel, take a moment now to subscribe, because we bring you real, thoroughly researched true crime cases like this one twice a week, always grounded in documented fact rather than speculation. A third man, Jason Autry, became central to the case against Zachary Adams in the months that followed his own arrest, and it was his cooperation, more than any physical evidence recovered from the scene, that would ultimately carry the prosecution's case all the way to a jury. Autry ultimately agreed to plead guilty and to testify against Adams, and it was his account, delivered in detailed testimony, that formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. According to Autry, he, Zachary Adams, and Dylan Adams had gone to the Bobo residence that morning intending to teach Holly's brother, Clint, how to manufacture methamphetamine, a claim Clint Bobo has consistently and firmly denied, telling investigators and later the public that he had no involvement with drugs and no prior relationship with any of the 3 men that would explain why they would have shown up at his family's home that morning for any such purpose. Autry testified that the men abducted Holly a short time after arriving, and that in the aftermath he personally helped move and reload her body into a truck before being dropped off elsewhere by Adams, a sequence of events he described in specific, granular detail to the jury. Details prosecutors argued only someone genuinely present at the scene could have known. It is important to state plainly what this means for how the case was ultimately proven in court, that the most detailed account of what happened to Holly Bobo came not from physical evidence recovered at a crime scene, but from the testimony of a man who had every incentive, facing his own serious charges, to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for leniency. Autry's account became, in effect, the narrative spine of the entire prosecution, the only detailed, moment-by-moment description of what happened to Holly after she disappeared into the trees behind her family's home, and it would remain the single most contested piece of the case for years to come, long after the trial itself had concluded. Holly's remains were not discovered until 2014, more than 3 years after she disappeared, found in a wooded area of northern Decatur County, not far from the community where she had last been seen alive. For a family that had spent more than 3 years attending vigils, distributing flyers, and fielding false leads like the pink purse mistaken for Holly's belongings. The discovery closed one agonizing chapter, even as it confirmed the outcome they had feared for so long. The discovery finally ended the massive, years-long search that had involved so much of the surrounding region, but it did not, on its own, answer every question investigators and prosecutors still needed to resolve before they could bring a case to trial. Forensic examination of skeletal remains recovered after more than 3 years of exposure to the elements presented its own significant limitations, the same kind of limitations that have complicated cold cases across the country, where the passage of time erodes the very physical evidence investigators most need in order to build an airtight case. That trial began in September 2017, more than 6 years after Holly Bobo disappeared, in a Tennessee courtroom that drew intense local and statewide media coverage throughout its duration, a reflection of just how deeply the case had embedded itself in the public consciousness of West Tennessee over the preceding 6.5 years. Of the 3 men originally implicated in her death, only Zachary Adams went before a jury. His brother, Dylan Adams, would later enter an Alford plea, a legal arrangement in which a defendant does not admit guilt but acknowledges that prosecutors have enough evidence to likely secure a conviction, to a reduced charge of facilitation of murder, receiving a sentence of 35 years, a resolution that came only after Dylan Adams had initially told investigators, back in March of 2014, that he had personally witnessed his brother rape and kill Holly Bobo, an account he would later walk back and characterize differently as the case moved toward its eventual plea agreement. Jason Autry, whose testimony formed the centerpiece of the case against Zachary Adams, was not prosecuted for his role in Holly's death in exchange for that cooperation. Those sources differ on the precise mechanics of that arrangement. Some describe a guilty plea followed by a sentence of time served, while other reporting states prosecutors simply declined to charge him at all. He was later sentenced to 19 years in federal prison on separate, unrelated weapons charges. 2 additional men, brothers Jeffrey Piercy and Mark Piercy, were also charged in connection with the case, accused of tampering with evidence and acting as accessories after the fact, reflecting how far the investigation's reach ultimately extended beyond the 3 men most directly implicated in Holly's abduction and death. At Zachary Adams's trial itself, prosecutors built their case largely on Autry's testimony, supplemented by circumstantial evidence, including items recovered along routes north of Darden during the years-long search, among them a SIM card and a receipt that investigators tied, to varying degrees, to the broader timeline of the case. It is a detail that has followed this case ever since, and that remains at the center of the ongoing public debate surrounding it, that no DNA evidence and no fingerprint evidence was ever presented linking Zachary Adams directly to Holly Bobo or to the location where her remains were found, an absence made all the more significant, given how central forensic evidence has become to how the American public understands and expects criminal cases to be proven in the years since high-profile DNA-driven exonerations and convictions became a fixture of national news coverage. On September 23, 2017, after 6.5 years of investigation, a jury found Zachary Adams guilty on all counts: first-degree felony murder, especially aggravated kidnapping, and aggravated rape. Inside the courtroom, the Bobo family's pastor, Don Franks, who had supported the family throughout the ordeal, led a prayer of relief once the verdict was read, later telling reporters that it had taken 6.5 years, countless tears, and enormous effort from law enforcement and volunteers alike to reach that moment. The jury was then set to return to decide whether Adams would face the death penalty. But just minutes before that sentencing hearing began, Adams accepted a deal offered by prosecutors. One the judge overseeing the case said he approved only with some reluctance, in which Adams agreed to a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole in exchange for prosecutors taking execution off the table. He was additionally sentenced to 50 consecutive years for the kidnapping and rape convictions, a term that, as a practical matter, ensures he will spend the remainder of his life incarcerated regardless of the specific sentence attached to each individual count. At the sentencing hearing, Holly Bobo addressed the court directly, describing her daughter as someone who appreciated the small things in life and calling her, in her own words, the sweetest soul she had ever known. The verdict did not end the legal proceedings surrounding Holly Bobo's case, and in the years since, it has continued to generate exactly the kind of sustained public debate that makes it different from many of the other solved cases this program has covered. Zachary Adams has consistently maintained his innocence since his conviction, and his defense team has pursued multiple avenues of appeal. On September 9, 2022, the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals upheld his conviction, rejecting every argument his attorneys raised, including claims that the evidence presented at trial was insufficient, that the trial court had erred in denying a motion to recuse, that the court had wrongly disqualified an attorney from the defense team, that certain evidence had been improperly admitted under Tennessee's rules governing character evidence, that a prior inconsistent statement should have been allowed, and that hearsay evidence had been wrongly admitted at trial. Adams's own attorney, Jennifer Thompson, had argued throughout these proceedings that the entire case against her client rested on what people said rather than on physical proof, telling reporters directly that there was, in her words, absolutely no evidence that ever linked Zachary Adams to Holly Bobo beyond witness testimony. That ruling might have closed the book on the legal side of Holly Bobo's case entirely, if not for a significant and troubling development involving the prosecution's key witness. At some point after the original trial, Jason Autry gave a recorded interview, made while he was not under oath, in which he stated that he had lied during his original testimony and that he had worked with a defense investigator to help construct a false narrative that ultimately put, in his own words, an innocent man in prison. According to accounts of that recorded statement, Autry described feeling a persistent sense of guilt over what he had done, a guilt that eventually led him to come forward, years after his testimony had already helped send Adams away for life. Adams's defense team seized on this recantation as grounds for a new trial, filing an extensive motion built substantially around Autry's changed account. A judge ultimately ruled that because Autry's recorded statement had been given outside of a sworn courtroom setting, it was legally inadmissible as grounds to overturn the conviction, but the recantation itself became a significant and widely reported part of the case's ongoing legal saga, cited repeatedly in subsequent hearings and in continued public commentary about the strength of the original case. The case returned to a Tennessee courtroom in June of 2024, 7 years after Adams's original conviction, with Holly's parents, Karen and Dana Bobo, once again present as legal arguments were heard over whether Adams deserved a new trial, a scene that itself illustrated how far this case remained from any kind of final closure even a decade after Holly's remains had been recovered. The post-conviction proceedings continued well into 2025, developing into what those covering the case described as a long-running evidentiary hearing that ultimately stretched across more than 8 separate days of testimony, an extraordinary length for a post-conviction hearing and a reflection of just how seriously the court was treating Autry's recantation and the broader challenge to Adams's conviction. Witnesses called during that extended hearing included a retired Memphis police officer who had conducted his own private investigation into the case over a period of years, driven by his own doubts about how the original investigation had been conducted. A Shelby County prosecutor who had been part of the original trial team and who defended the state's handling of Dylan Adams's shifting and at times inconsistent statements, and a former Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agent who had worked the Holly Bobo investigation for years and who was called upon to walk the court in painstaking detail back through the original case file. In November of that year, Zachary Adams himself testified at his own post-conviction relief hearing, something he had not done at his original 2017 trial, a decision defense attorneys in cases like his often avoid precisely because it exposes a defendant to cross-examination they cannot control. During that testimony, Adams stated that he had never known Holly Bobo, beyond the fact that her mother had once been his teacher, and he directly denied ever having admitted to killing her. His defense presented ATM footage from nearby Parsons, Tennessee, time-stamped at 11:12 in the morning on the day of Holly's abduction, showing a truck that his attorney argued supported an alibi, placing Adams elsewhere at the time of the crime. Evidence his defense team acknowledged had not been effectively presented at the original trial, describing it in later filings as, at best, a partial alibi that should have been part of the jury's original deliberations. The presiding judge, however, ruled that no individual could actually be identified or recognized in that footage, limiting its value as proof of anything definitive about where Adams was or was not that morning. In July of 2026, Hardin County Circuit Judge J. Brent Bradbury issued his ruling, denying Zachary Adams's petition for a new trial and dismissing the challenge built around Jason Autry's recantation, bringing to a close, at least for now, the most serious legal threat to Adams's conviction since it was first handed down nearly 9 years earlier. Holly Bobo's family released a statement following the ruling, expressing that while nothing about the decision could bring their daughter back or erase the grief they had carried for more than 15 years, knowing that a jury had found her killer guilty, and that the verdict had now withstood multiple rounds of appellate and post-conviction scrutiny, brought them what they described as some measure of peace. It is worth pausing on that phrase, some measure of peace, because it captures something honest about how families in cases like this one experience resolution. It is rarely total, and it rarely erases the underlying loss. But after 15 years of vigils, false leads, a 6.5-year wait for a trial, and then nearly 9 additional years of appeals and post-conviction hearings, even a partial and hard-won peace represents something the Bobo family had to fight through an extraordinarily long legal process to reach. As of the writing of this account, Zachary Adams's conviction stands, upheld through a direct appeal, a court of criminal appeals review, and an extensive post-conviction hearing centered on a key witness's later recantation, though Adams's attorneys have indicated the fight is not necessarily over, and further appeals within the Tennessee court system remain a legal possibility going forward. What makes Holly Bobo's case difficult to summarize in the same simple terms as a fully closed investigation is the genuine and persistent gap between its legal status and the public debate that continues to surround it. Under Tennessee law, and as far as every court that has reviewed this case is concerned, the matter is settled. Zachary Adams was convicted by a jury of his peers, and that conviction has been tested and upheld repeatedly in the years since, through direct appeal, appellate review, and an extensive post-conviction hearing that gave his defense every reasonable opportunity to present new evidence and challenge the original verdict. At the same time, it is simply accurate to note that no physical evidence, no DNA, and no fingerprints have ever publicly been presented linking Adams to the crime itself, that the case rested substantially on testimony from co-defendants who had strong incentives to cooperate with prosecutors, and that one of those key witnesses later stated, outside of a courtroom setting, that his testimony had not been truthful. These are not allegations invented for this program. They are documented facts drawn directly from court filings, appellate rulings, and years of consistent news coverage. Facts that exist alongside, not in place of, the legal reality that a jury convicted Zachary Adams, and that every court to review that conviction since has allowed it to stand. Reasonable people who have followed this case closely over the years have reached different conclusions about how much weight to give each side of that gap. Some point to the consistency of Autry's original testimony, delivered under oath and cross-examined at trial, and to the fact that a Tennessee appellate court, reviewing the complete trial record with fresh eyes, found the evidence sufficient to sustain the conviction, a conclusion reinforced further by the extensive 2025 evidentiary hearing that gave Adams's defense every opportunity to dismantle the state's case and ultimately failed to persuade the court to grant a new trial. Others point to the complete absence of forensic evidence tying Adams to the crime scene, to the extraordinary length of time between Holly's disappearance and any arrest, and to the fact that the case's central witness later said, in his own words, that an innocent man was sitting in prison because of what he had said on the stand, a statement that, even if legally inadmissible as grounds for a new trial, remains a documented and troubling part of this case's public record regardless of how. Any court has since ruled on its legal weight. This program does not claim to resolve that debate, and it would be dishonest to pretend that either side of it can simply be dismissed. What can be said with certainty is that Holly Bobo, a 20-year-old nursing student with the future she never got the chance to build, disappeared from a few dozen steps outside her own family's home on an ordinary April morning in 2011, that her family endured more than 3 years without knowing what had happened to her, that a man was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison for kidnapping, rape, and murder, and that the legal system, however contested some of its conclusions, remain in the eyes of the public, ultimately delivered a verdict that her family has described, after everything, as a measure of peace. 15 years is a long time to wait for any kind of resolution, and it is longer still when that resolution continues to be tested, year after year, in courtrooms the family must keep returning to. Karen and Dana Bobo have now spent more than a decade and a half attending hearings, reading rulings, and sitting through testimony describing, in exhaustive detail, the worst thing that has ever happened to their family. Their son Clint, the last person to see his sister alive, has carried for 15 years the particular weight of having witnessed the moment that changed everything and having been unable to stop it, unable even to fully describe the man walking beside her, a burden made no lighter by the fact that nothing about what he saw that morning would have reasonably alerted anyone at the time that they were watching the last moments of his sister's life play out in front of them. Holly's case has also become, over the years, a frequently cited example in broader conversations among Tennessee legal observers and journalists about the tension between finality and fairness in the American justice system, about how long an appeals process should reasonably continue, and about what obligation, if any, a court owes to a recanting witness whose original testimony helped secure a conviction. More than 15 years after that April morning, Holly Bobo is remembered by the people who loved her not as a case file or a legal argument, but as a young woman who walked toward the tree line on her way to becoming a nurse and never came home. If you found value in this story, please consider hitting subscribe and leaving a like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next real cold case investigation. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening and watching.